Today, we're going to talk about the past tense. In other words, the verb forms used to describe events that have already occurred. First, let's look at some sentences in the present tense for the purpose of comparison. These are things that are currently occurring. Notice that the verbs are conjugated and in normal position, second in statements, and first in yes or no questions. Now, compare these to the equivalent ideas, but this time expressed in the past tense. These actions have already occurred. Notice that in each sentence, the original verb has been replaced by a conjugated form of haben, and the original verb has both been moved to the end of the sentence and been changed slightly. It now starts with ge and ends with t. The form of haben is what's known as the helping verb in the past tense. And the other form, the one at the end, is known as the past participle. Using these two verbs together, helping verb and past participle, creates the past tense form known as the present perfect tense. Let's talk about how to create this past tense yourself. Step 1 is to conjugate a form of haben for the sentence's subject, and put this form of haben in standard verb position. That takes care of the helping verb. Step 2 is to create a past participle. This is done by adding the letters ge to the beginning of the verb stem, and the letter t to the end of the verb stem. Step 3 is to put the past participle at the end of its sentence or clause. Now, let's go into a little more detail about how to actually create that participle. Let's take the infinitive verb machen. We'd remove the en to get the stem, so the past participle of machen is therefore gemacht. With the verb spielen, we again remove the en and create the participle gespielt. With küssen, same principle applies. We'd remove the en, and the participle would become geküsst. Now let's see how this works in a full sentence. With spielen, one that we just saw, we would have a sentence like Ich habe gestern Fußball gespielt. The participle that we just made is at the end, and the conjugated form of haben is in second position. It works similarly with other verbs. For tanzen, for instance, we'd have meine Freunde und ich haben getanzt. Using the verb holen, which means to get or fetch, we'd have meine Mutter hat 1 Kilo Hackfleisch beim Metzger geholt. Notice that the verb is still at the end, even though that's a very long sentence. With kaufen, we could ask, Hast du das weiße T-Shirt gekauft? Or with machen, which we already also just did, Hast du die Hausaufgaben schon gemacht? Now, this may seem very simple to do, and for the most part, it actually is. But unfortunately, there are many verbs that do not follow this general pattern. While regular verbs are predictable, there are a bunch of irregular verbs that need to be learned on their own. Before you get too frustrated about this, though, keep in mind that most languages, including English, have lots of irregular verbs. Once you have become very familiar with them, using them will become second nature. The good news about irregular verbs is that you'll still need a conjugated form of haben in standard verb position. Also, the past participle will still go at the end of the sentence or clause, just like it did in the examples we just saw with regular verbs. What makes irregular verbs tricky, of course, is that the past participle itself is irregular or unpredictable. It doesn't follow a simple pattern like adding a GE and a T. Here are some verbs you will probably have encountered so far, listed with their irregular past participles. For instance, essen would become not geesst, but gegessen, irregular. Gießen becomes gegossen. Helfen, which means to help, becomes geholfen. Lesen would become gelesen. Schlafen turns into geschlafen in the past tense. Schreiben becomes geschrieben. Watch out for your EI and IE on that one. Sehen becomes gesehen in the past tense. Trinken becomes getrunken. And ziehen, as in anziehen, becomes gezogen. Now these are important verbs, and unfortunately you'll just have to practice them a lot until you master them. There are some other exceptions or quirks that you should be aware of so you don't learn the past tense wrong the first time. First of all, verbs ending in ieren, I-E-R-E-N, do not add the usual g to the participle. For instance, sortieren just becomes sortiert, not gesortiert. So a past tense sentence involving sortieren might sound like this: Ich habe den Müll sortiert. Same with telefonieren, which also ends in ieren. Ich habe mit Sandra telefoniert. Or with probieren, which means to try. Hast du das Hähnchen probiert? Also, verbs with inseparable prefixes, prefixes like be, ge, or ver, also do not add a ge to their verb stems in the past tense. For instance, besuchen becomes besucht, not gebesucht. Gefallen would become just plain old gefallen, not gefallen. For instance, you could say, Ich habe gestern meine Freunde besucht. Or with gefallen, you could say, Das Buch hat mir sehr gut gefallen. Or with vergessen, you could say, Ich habe die Hausaufgaben vergessen. But I'm sure you'd never have to say that. Finally, let's talk a little bit about verbs with separable prefixes. Prefixes like an, aus, ab, or auf, etc. These will put the g between the prefix and the stem in their past participles. For instance, aufräumen in the past tense would sound like this: Ich habe heute mein Zimmer aufgeräumt. Abräumen would look like this: Hast du den Tisch abgeräumt? With anziehen, which is irregular, remember, you'd say, Ich habe einen Rock zur Fete angezogen. And with aussehen, which is also irregular and separable, we could say, Der Kuchen hat lecker ausgesehen. The cake looked delicious. Almost done, but there's one other thing you need to know about the past tense. Every now and then, a verb will not use the helping verb haben in the past tense. Instead, it will use the helping verb sein. This takes some getting used to, because we almost never do this in English, but luckily there is actually a pattern to these. All verbs used with sein have something in common, and that's that they all indicate a change of location or state. Now, you might be thinking that verbs are actions and therefore will always involve some kind of motion. That may be true, but what we're really talking about here are verbs that, by their very nature, get the subject, the verb doer, from point A to point B, or condition A to condition B. For you grammar nerds out there, these are often referred to as intransitive verbs, verbs that can never have direct objects because they can't actually be done to something. Here are some of the verbs that take sein that you might have encountered so far. Fahren doesn't use haben, it uses sein, so you'd say bist du mit der U-Bahn gefahren, not hast du. With gehen, we'd say ich bin gestern ins Kino gegangen, again conjugated form of sein, not a form of haben. With kommen, we'd say letztes Jahr ist Katja mit dem Bus zur Schule gekommen. With laufen, we could say seid ihr im Winter Ski gelaufen? With reiten, which means to ride a horse, we could say something like wir sind schnell geritten. With schwimmen, we could say meine Freunde sind am Wochenende geschwommen. Notice that in each of these examples, the helping verb is not haben, but is instead a conjugated form of sein. This is because these verbs are ways to get from point A to point B: driving, going, riding, running, etc. And these are verbs that all inherently involve a change of location. Also, notice that the participles of these tend to be irregular. This means you'll need to practice these verbs a little more because they have both irregular participles and the helping verb sein. Let's review what you need to know to create past tense statements and questions in German. First of all, for most verbs, you'll need to use the helping verb haben that you'll conjugate and put into the normal verb position. For regular verbs, you will create a past participle by adding ge to the beginning and t to the end of the verb stem, and this participle will go last in the sentence in final position. For an irregular verb, you'll have to just learn the participle because it doesn't follow the same pattern as the other regular verbs. Now, some verbs, ones that involve changing place or condition, will use the helping verb sein instead of haben. These also tend to be irregular verbs, so their participles will need to be memorized as well. Finally, there are some kinds of verbs that don't add g to the participle, verbs that end in ieren, or verbs with inseparable prefixes. And finally, separable verbs will put the ge between the prefix and the verb stem.